Hello, sixth graders, and welcome back to our continuing tour of Asia. And our next stop is China. This vast country. It's going to be kind of a big one. There's a big country, big lecture. So hopefully you can get all of this information and enjoy it and learn a lot from it. First thing we're going to start with is the size of China and its population. That's its population is probably the thing everybody knows about China. They say, wow, there are a lot of people live in China, and that is 20% of the world's population live in this country. Now, just like our country, you'll notice on the population map in your atlas, that's on page 177, but also on the population map up here in the corner, that most of the people live in eastern China. In fact, the population density in the West is much less. And I use the United States as a comparison. We have a very similar situation in the United States where the eastern part of our country is much more population dense than the western part. All right. 92%, unlike the sort of diversity in our country, 92% of the people who live in China are what are called Han Chinese. That doesn't mean they all speak the same language. There are many variations of Chinese, Chinese language, Mandarin being the most common. But 92% of the people are of Chinese ethnicity, and they're known as the Han Chinese. And that is named for a dynasty, the Han Chinese, that existed between 206 BC and 220 AD, the Han Dynasty. Now, in terms of its area, China's size, its square miles, it's just a little bit below the United States. In some sites, you will see that China is placed above the United States in terms of its land area. But according to one site, it was 3.8 million square miles to the United States to China's 3.7. But the big difference is the population. We have a population of 328 million in that 3.8 billion square miles, and they have a population of 1.44 billion. So population density overall in the United States is about 93 people per square mile. And in China, they have a population density of 397 people per square mile. And considering how thin the population is in the western part of China, you can just imagine how crowded the different areas of China can be in the east. Now, you'll look at this map, you say, wait, is this another population map? No, this is the agricultural map. And that's one of the stunning things about China when we think about agriculture in China, that where they grow their food is the same place where their people live. Like in the United States, we have a lot of farmland around here in Pennsylvania, a lot of other states. But some of our biggest farmland is in the Great Plains. We have a vast area that is very suitable for farming where not many people live. And so we can have these massive farms. In fact, the US has like 1.4 million square miles of farmland. And China actually has less than half that. They only have 540,000 square miles. And even less than that actually supports crops all the time. So on a very small amount of land, China feeds 20% of the world's population. Generally speaking, the United States is a food exporter. We can grow enough food for our population and we can sell it overseas as well. So the United States is generally a food exporter, but China is able to grow a remarkable amount of food in the land. Now, what do they grow? 25% of all of that farmland is dedicated to rice. They're not the biggest rice grower in the world, but definitely it's an important crop in China. We're going to talk about rice in the next slide. China is also, interestingly enough, the world's largest producer of potatoes, both white potatoes and sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes is a huge product it grows in a huge amount in China. And wheat is another important crop. There are many others, sesame seeds, sunflower seeds. They grow those to produce oil for cooking, sunflower oil, sesame oil. And they also grow tea is very popular in China. If you've ever been to a Chinese restaurant, you know you can always get a pot of tea. And among the most popular is the jasmine tea. That's very popular in China, but they also grow green tea and regular black tea like Lipton or Red Rose and other such things. And they also grow other crops like cotton and other things for fibers and so forth. So China is remarkably efficient in their use of their farmland. Now, growing rice, such a fascinating subject, and I love doing this every year, and I always have to re-up my knowledge on growing rice. First of all, rice fields are known as rice paddies. All right, those are the fields where they grow the rice, and those fields are split into two different areas. There's one called a sowing field. That's where they plant the initial seeds, and then a planting field. Now you'll notice if you look at the people that's in the planting field, they're planting the individual shoots of rice in that field. You can't see their feet because it's water, it's mud. Um, Rice thrives in wet water. Most weeds don't. So they do plow the fields to stop the growth of weeds, but weeds generally don't like growing underwater where rice plants do, okay, from under the water up above. So what happens is when the sowing field, which is usually a lot of times the rice grows in monsoon climates because when that initial rain comes, it floods many of the fields. So there is a monsoon, not just the Indian monsoon that we studied, but there's a monsoon that comes in off the Pacific into China, in the southern part of China, and that is where they grow a great deal of their rice. So you start with a sowing field where you scatter the seed all over this field, and then and it grows in these really tight bunches. And then after about a month, and they've been preparing their planting fields during this time by plowing and so forth, sometimes using mechanical plows, but that can be really tough given the water, that how deep the water is in these fields. But they also use what are water buffalo to plow their fields in Asia. And what they will do is after the plant grows for about a month, they will pull them out, literally just yank them out of that wet ground and replant them individually in the planting field. And that's what's going on in this top picture. They're replanting all of those little rice seedlings that have grown for about a month into the planting field where they're going to grow for another 2 or 3 months or so. Okay, now it looks like grass. That is ultimately, but it'll eventually will grow and have these stalks, right? That will grow, and they'll grow to about 3 feet high. And after that 3 months, 2.5 months, what have you, depending on the growing season, you'll see those stalks, and you can see that in the corner. Those are rice. That's the rice that's growing at the top of those stalks, those little rice grains. And so once it reaches maturity, it turns kind of yellowish like that. They cut down the stalks either mechanically or with a sickle, and then they thresh the grain. And that is threshing is either done mechanically or manually. And what does that mean? Well, if it's done manually, they take those grains of rice and they pound them onto a mat, and that separates the grains of rice from the stalk, and then they throw the stalk away. Or they throw the stalks into machines, and that separates the grains of rice from the stalk. So that's the threshing part. Now, once you thresh the rice, you have to dry it. It has to dry for a couple of days in the sun, or they can take them to machine silos where they will be drawn by air blown into the silos. The rice grains will be blown dry, or sometimes they're just laid out in massive mats and dried in the sun. And then you have to separate the husk from the grain. You have to from the grain of rice that's inside the husk. That's not what rice looks like. Rice is the small seed inside the husk. The husk is that dry outer covering of the rice. And that's either done by hand, which is amazing to watch. They shake it on these mats, and the husk falls off the rice, and then they separate the rice that way. Or again, it's done by machine, which is much easier. And then the rice is processed and put in these giant bags, and voila, it's ready to eat. It is quite a process, as you can tell, the growing of rice. Really kind of cool to study. All right, now we're going to talk about one of the great features that man conquers nature is the Grand Canal. Most rivers in China, as you can tell from this map, generally run west to east. They rise. Most of them rise up in the Tibetan Plateau. That's where their source is, and then they flow going west to east, and then emptying into either the Yellow Sea or the East China Sea, or whatever areas toward basically arms of the Pacific Ocean. So that meant that travel in China, just like in our own country, I-79 kind of runs roughly, along where the Allegheny runs and Monongahela run. If you ever go on I-81, that basically follows the path of the Susquehanna, I-81. Where I grew up in Connecticut, the Connecticut River has there's a highway 91 that goes right borders the Connecticut River. So that is the way things travel. So in order to encourage travel south and north, way back in 486 BC, someone got the great idea of building a canal that would hopefully connect the Yellow River to the north to the Yangtze River in the south, the two main, very important rivers in China. It was called the Grand Canal. This started in 486 BC, and for centuries, the building of this canal went on until it was finally completed in 609. And then over the years in the Ming Dynasty and centuries in the Ming Dynasty, improvements were made. It was dug deeper so larger ships could go in there. And that encouraged products to go from north to south, as well as people to travel from north to south in China. And there's a picture of the map of the canal. It starts in Beijing, actually, north of the Yellow River, and ends at the Yangtze River in Wanghang in southern China and or the more central China actually. And that's a picture of the canal itself. That is basically a man-made river that was built over centuries in China. So a very impressive thing. It is the longest canal in the world. It's over 1,000 miles in length. Pretty impressive. Now we're going to go to a unique area in China known as Tibet. Tibet is often called by people the rooftop of the world because it is the highest plateau in the world. It ranges anywhere from 13,000 to 15,000 feet. Remember our definition, a plateau is a markedly elevated tract of comparably flat or level land. And you can kind of see the flatness of the Tibetan plateau if you look on your atlas on the Asia map of the physical features. You'll see how flat the region of Tibet actually looks. It's been an area in China that's suffered a little bit of controversy. The Communist government of China incorporated Tibet into China, or annexed it. Some would say invaded, some would say conquered, in 1951. It's a complicated story. For many years, Tibet was pretty much under the control of China during the imperial years. There's been a movement since then to free Tibet from Chinese control, and it has not been successful. Now, Tibet, like Bhutan, was a Buddhist kingdom, and it was ruled by a man by the name of the Dalai Lama. That was the official title. The picture of that man there below the map of Tibet is the current Dalai Lama. He's the 14th Dalai Lama, and he's the leader of Tibet in exile. He moved to India, where he's lived, and he's traveled around the world trying to talk about the plight of the Tibetan people. He's 84 years old. The Dalai Lama is. And so one of the unique things is Tibet, because it's 13,000, 15,000 feet up there, one of the things that engineers said could never happen is that there would never be a railway that could connect Tibet to the rest of the world. Some kind of road that that could get up to 13,000 feet from comparatively flat land in China. But they did it anyway. It was a remarkable thing. They built a giant railroad that connected Tibet to China, the Qinghai Tibet Railway. And with that railway connection, many of the Han Chinese moved into Tibet. So there's the population is starting to grow to be more Chinese than Tibetan, although Tibetan is still the majority population in Tibet. Now, one of the things that's amazing is, we talked about how rivers, in our definition of river, starts at higher ground. Well, Tibet is higher ground, and it is the beginning of an astounding number of rivers. This is just a few of them. The Yellow River starts in Tibet. The Yangtze River starts in Tibet. The Mekong that goes down to Vietnam starts in Tibet. The Brahmaputra, you guys know that one, that ends in the Bangladesh. And the Indus River that runs through Pakistan, and the Irrawaddy River that goes to Myanmar. All of these rivers start at the Tibetan Plateau. It's just a stunning amount of rivers start there, in addition to many others that start in Tibet. Now, in the northern part of China, one of the unique features is the sixth largest desert in the world, the second largest in Asia, and that is the Gobi Desert. Okay. Now, this is really high in latitude. The Gobi Desert is roughly the same latitude as Erie, Pennsylvania. And you wouldn't think, oh, wow, I think I'm going to go look up in Erie, Pennsylvania for a desert. Why is there a desert at such a high latitude? All right. Kind of unusual. Well, the reason for that is the Tibet and the Himalayas, that high land. And you remember when we studied the monsoons in India, and you probably, I hope I mentioned here, you studied rain shadows in earth science. I think you might have covered that. But what happens is when those monsoon rains and clouds come in, they hit the Himalayas and Mount Everest, and they stop dead right there, and they can't get over that high mountain. So on the other side of that, the rain shadow, literally, on the other side of the Everest is Tibet and the Gobi, and those are relatively dry lands compared to the, what's on the India side and the South Asia side. So it doesn't receive the benefit. Now, there is a Pacific monsoon that sometimes comes in and touches the Gobi and causes flash floods and so forth. But generally speaking, the Gobi is a cold desert, a dry desert because of its high elevation. There is snow. It can snow in the Gobi Desert because these rough winds come down from Siberia. Remember, the Gobi borders Siberia. These rough winds come down from the Gobi and from the Siberia, and it actually causes snow. Now, there are camels in the Gobi Desert, just like we saw in the Sahara, but that's a picture of one. That's the Bactrian camel. That is not a wild Bactrian camel. There are some wild Bactrian camels that live in the Gobi Desert. But in order to get enough water to survive in the desert, they often have to eat the snow, which can be really dangerous for their little tummies. Because if you eat too much snow, that doesn't do good for your digestive system. So they have to eat snow in a very measured way. They can't have too much of it at one time to survive because the snow doesn't melt into little puddles of water. The snow just evaporates after it falls in the Gobi. So they have to do enough to get the waters, and that is a picture of the double hump Bactrian camel right there. So the temperature can range is crazy in the Gobi Desert. In the wintertime, it can be as much as 40 degrees below zero, freezing cold. And in the summertime, as high as 113 degrees. And I know we talked about the Sahara, how there's temperature range, high-low temperatures. But in the Gobi, the temperature range can drop between 63 degrees temperature drop or rise in 24 hours. It's just a stunning amount. Now, one of the big problems of the Gobi right now, in reference to China, is called desertification, like we studied in the Sahara Desert. And this is a picture of the Gobi Desert that is encroaching on northern China. And in an effort to stop this, China has decided to try a really aggressive effort to basically plant trees in suitable areas to stop the growth of the desert in those areas. And they call it the Great Green Wall, kind of making a thing about the Great Wall of China. They call it the Great Green Wall. And they take fast-growing trees and they plant it, and it's hopefully going to stop desertification. This plan was instituted like 1978, and they plan on carrying it out through 2050. But of course, just like the situation in the Soviet Union with the Aral Sea and all those things, they've had problems with this because once they plant those trees, they're already in an area where there isn't much water, and those trees will use up a lot of the groundwater that the people rely on for drinking water and so forth. So whenever you mess with nature, trying to build the Great Green Wall, um, there have to be other ways and effort to do it, and a lot of people are advocating other means other than this to stop the desertification of China. Now, the last one I'm going to do is a little controversial. It's the Zhejiang province. Um, Zhejiang province is the extreme west of China. You see on this map, it doesn't show you that green Zhejiang province is called the autonomous region, kind of implying that it's free, it's on its own. It's not. It is controlled by China. But you'll notice Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, India. You will notice that the Zhejiang province is connected to Central Asia. And because of that, and I didn't mention this in the Central Asia talk, but Islam is the major religion of Central Asia. And the Zhejiang people, the people who live there are called Uyghurs. The Uyghurs practice Islam. And in a communist country, its religion practice is really frowned upon by communist governments. They're atheistic governments. They officially, as a government, say God does not exist. So they frown on the practice of religion, and the people, the Uyghurs, are very devoted Muslims. So there have been efforts by China to suppress the Uyghur Islamic people. And this is a picture of what they call in China a re-education camp, but is in effect a political prison. And in those camps, they try to use to totally get their minds away from God, away from Islam, away from their religious practices, and get them thinking along with the communist China's. And the estimates are extreme. Hundreds of thousands to even estimates of over 1 million people have been put in these detention camps in an effort to have them be good communist citizens of China. And again, just like in Tibet, many Han Chinese are now moving into the province in an effort to kind of balance out the Uyghur and the Chinese communists are moving in there to in effect make it more of a homogenous country. So this is an area of great concern to the United States and other countries, the fact that these people are being put in these detention camps. So I'm sorry I had to end on a sad note like that, but that is our talk on China. And hopefully it's a lengthy lecture, and we're going to have a quiz on this next Wednesday. But thank you for listening.